Good morning. I'm Jamie Cashman, Government Relations Manager here at the Iowa State Association of Counties.
And I'm Lucas Binkin, Public Policy Specialist.
And we're happy to come before you today to give you an overview of the 2018 Iowa legislative session and to give you an update on ISAC's priorities, legislative objectives, and to give you an overview of the 2019 legislative policy development process. And first, we'll start out with the ISAC's legislative priorities. Lucas?
One of our top priorities this year was to make sure that the commercial and industrial property tax backfill was fully funded. This is a result of the 2013 property tax legislation that, as part of it, rolled back the taxable value of commercial and industrial property, and the state agreed to make up for the lost revenue to local governments with what's become known as the backfill. This is about $152 million per year that goes to local governments, about $29 million of which goes to county governments. So we want to make sure that property taxes stay low and counties can continue to provide services that their citizens rely on. And in order to make sure that that happens, we want to maintain the backfill. So you probably know from all of the emails and action alerts that this became a pretty big topic this year. Both the House and Senate had proposals that would either phase out or drastically scale back the backfill dollars. And until the very last day of session, we were working to make sure that that was fully funded. And as a note, because it is a standing appropriation, the legislature would have to take action for it to not be fully funded. So that's why we are continuing to work on this until the very last day of session to make sure that it was fully funded. Just to give you an idea of some of the proposals that came out this year, the Senate proposed a 2-year phase-out, which would actually scale back by 1/3 in the first year, 2/3 in the second year, and then the backfill would be completely eliminated in year 3. The House was a little more responsible in a longer-term phase-out and a standing appropriation. They would reduce that $152 million to $100 million in year 1, $75 million down to $50 million, and then down to $25 million where it would stay. Towards the end of session, the Senate came up with a different plan that would look at the statewide valuation growth and split all local jurisdictions into those that had either grown faster than the statewide average or grown slower than the statewide average, and then put in place either a 3 or 6 year phase out. Ultimately, the House and Senate could not agree on a proposal to phase out the backfill, which is a very good thing, and it was ultimately fully funded for fiscal year 19 and for future years. Jamie, another one of our top priorities is on mental health, and you had a pretty busy year.
It definitely was, Lucas. One of the major pieces of legislation that was passed by the Iowa General Assembly this year was House File 2456. And this legislation followed the recommendation of the Complex Needs Study Work Group. And basically what this legislation did was address individuals with complex mental health needs. And it did this by the following: by creating 6 regional access centers, 22 assertive community treatment teams, and intensive residential service homes that provide services up to 120 persons statewide. So we believe this is a very positive step in addressing additional mental health needs that are out there. One of the biggest things, now it moves some of these services that were once Core Plus to Core services, but a majority of these services will be funded by Medicaid. So obviously this is something that we're watching very closely with any changes that we're seeing with the Affordable Care Act out in Washington. One of the things, though, that wasn't addressed was addressing long-term mental health funding. However, there was language in legislation last year and again this year that will call for an interim study that would look at providing sustainable funding for the mental health and disability services system throughout Iowa. Our next legislative priority was addressed in the first couple weeks of the session with water quality improvement. and that was found in legislation in Senate File 512. And what this would do is provide $282 million in funding for water quality improvements throughout the state. Roughly half the money would go towards on-farm demonstration projects, buffer strips, bioreactors, and other practices, and the rest of the money would go towards wastewater treatment facilities throughout the state of Iowa. And we were very pleased that this was tackled very early on in the session, but we were disappointed the Iowa Water and Land Legacy, or IWIL, was not addressed this year. I know there were some amendments to the Water Quality Improvement Bill on Senate File 512, but unfortunately that amendment was voted down. This is something that we will continue to push forward, as we believe that this is an important deal to provide essential water quality improvements as well as essential quality of life for our citizens of Iowa.
The ISAC legislative objectives are those ideas brought forth by our members where we actively go out and pursue legislative changes. The first of our objectives this year that we were able to get signed by the governor was a proposal from the recorders on the Groundwater Hazard statement. Currently, the requirements for recording documents put in place certain formatting requirements that this statement and this form did not meet. The form is used by the DNR, seems to be working well, so rather than changing that form, we simply ask that the groundwater hazard statement be exempt from those formatting requirements. The treasurers brought forth, once again, the security interest provisions objective. This would allow for the release of a lien on a vehicle to be done either as it is currently done, which is signing on the title, or with a separate notarized form or letter from the financial institution when the lien is released. Because different states do this different ways, there is a lot of pushing paper back and forth and some confusion being caused. So this legislation simply opened that up to allow for different methods of releasing the lien.
We were also pleased that two of ISAC's longtime legislative objectives passed the Iowa legislature and were signed into law. The first comes from our Environmental Health Association pertaining to food fees. As we have seen food fees not raised in several years, many of these county food inspection programs have gone back to the Iowa Department of Inspection and Appeals. And now for the first time in many years, these food fees have been modernized and raised to cover the cost of business for these programs. And we see many of these county food inspection programs will be maintained, and we might see counties go back and restore their programs. The next legislative objective that passed comes from the auditor's affiliate, and this is pertaining to the printing of County Board of Supervisors resolutions. And this would allow counties to print a summary of County Boards of Supervisors resolutions in the newspapers instead of the full text. The full text would then be provided via the county's website or in person at the county auditor's office.
Each year we also deal with legislation that we didn't propose, but that we are in favor of, either because one of our affiliates brought it forward or we have a policy statement stating our support. This year, a couple of pieces of legislation that we were registered for were signed by the governor. First, a proposal from the assessor's affiliate that would allow the assessor to electronically send the assessment notices rather than mailing them. Both the county and the property owner would opt in, so it is completely optional for both the county to take on this program and for individual property owners to opt in and receive their electronic assessment notices. Another piece of legislation we were in favor of was the expansion of the members of the Commission of Veterans Affairs to include 2 additional members, one of them being a representative from the Iowa Association of County Commissioners and Veterans Service Officers. This was also signed by the governor. There's also legislation each year that ISAC registers undecided on. This could be because we don't have a policy statement declaring that we are supportive or opposed to the legislation, or we could have a split in our membership with some supportive and some opposed. But we do want to register on these bills because we will be interested in them and we'll be following them. We just might not have a clear for or against position. Some of the legislation that was signed this year that ISAC was registered undecided on included the large income tax reform bill. This would give up to $400 million in income tax relief for both corporations and individuals. It lowers the tax rates for both corporations and individuals and reduces the number of tax brackets for individuals. It also eliminates some tax credits and phases out federal deductibility. In measures that would bring in more revenue, there are new sales taxes on online purchases, ride-sharing services, and subscription services. ISAC will be watching this because any reduction in state revenue could have an impact on services that our mutual constituents enjoy, as well as dollars that could be flowing to county governments. Another piece of legislation that we registered undecided on had to do with local operating funds. Currently, excess funds can only be invested in financial instruments that mature in less than 397 days. This legislation changed so that funds in excess of 33% of anticipated operating funds could be invested in instruments with a maturity of 63 months or less. In 2015, with the passage of the gas tax, there was a requirement put in place that county engineers submit bridge reports to show the state the progress being made on replacing and repairing deficient bridges. This was set to sunset next year, and this legislation repealed that sunset so that those reports will be required going into the future. And finally, we watched closely all of the appropriations bills. A couple items of note this year. REAP was funded at $12 million. This is supposed to be a standing appropriation of $20 million, so we were disappointed that this was not fully funded, although it has never been fully funded, but this $12 million is a decrease from years past where it's been funded at $16 million. We were happy to see that the appropriations to the County Veterans Affairs Commissions was restored to the full $990,000. So each county will once again receive $10,000 from that appropriation. And finally, all of the property tax credits were fully funded again this year. This would be things like the homestead credit, the elderly and disabled, and the family farm credit.
In addition, a lot of what Lucas and I unfortunately have to do during the legislative session is to do a lot of defense on legislation that is detrimental to the counties, and this session was no exception. First, one of the bills that we were opposed to was Senate File 481, and this is an immigration bill that is looking to address sanctuary counties or cities. First of all, we don't believe that there's any county in the state that has declared themselves a sanctuary county. And what this legislation does is it would punish local entities for failing to follow through with a detainer request from Immigrations, Customs, and Enforcement. And we have some major concerns on that. In that, first of all, local law enforcement may not have the space or the personnel to house a detainee above and beyond the time that they are in jail. And second, there's some major constitutional concerns that was raised by this legislation as well. And so we believe this is a total infringement on local home rule, and that's why we were opposed to the legislation. Another bill that we were opposed to that unfortunately moved forward had to do with lease purchase contracts. And this is a process that would allow a county or a city to pay for new building construction period over time, as opposed to having a bond issue to pay for the building. And basically what this legislation calls for is that anyone going through a lease purchase contract would have to follow the competitive bidding process, and which we don't have any problems obviously following the bidding process, as counties and cities do it all the time. We just believe in just taking this out and basically prescribing how lease purchase contracts would move forward. This again is infringement on county home rule. And Lucas, I believe there's some other things that we were opposed to as well this year.
Yes, unfortunately, the cattle guard bill did go through and get signed by the governor this year. This would allow a property owner to install a cattle guard rather than a fence for keeping their livestock under control. There were some additional provisions put in, such as requiring the land on both sides of the road to be owned by the same person. It can only be on level B and level C roads, and some other requirements. But again, this is an infringement on the local decision making of the boards of supervisors and the county engineer in deciding what's best for the maintenance of their road and keeping those public assets safe. There was also a telecommunications bill that changed the way that telecommunications property will be assessed. First, it moves all of the transmission property from a centrally assessed to locally assessed process, and provides an exemption for the wires, cables, and electronic equipment. So those properties will be exempt from property taxation moving forward. There will be a 4-year phase-in, and it's also important to note that the exemption from Senate File 295 will be phased out. And another big local control issue that we were dealing with most of the session in various forms was on supervisor district plans. The bill that ended up passing would change the way that the maps are drawn after redistricting. Now the Legislative Service Agency, the state agency, would draw those maps for counties that have Supervisor District Plan 3, which is the equal population districts and voted by the district. And for those counties over 60,000 in population that are in Plan 3, and that is currently only Polk and Lynn counties, if they want to move away from Plan 3, it would take 2/3 vote of their citizens to change. We think a simple majority of the voters can decide how they want to be represented, and this is an issue for the local voters to decide, not for the legislature to get involved with.
Every year, Lucas and I work on legislation that is detrimental to counties and make sure that the legislation does not move forward. And this year brought another season of defense for the ISAC legislative team. There were several bills, again, that were especially detrimental to the counties, and the first was on the repeal of the bottle bill. ISAC has long supported, indeed, its expansion of the bottle bill by coverage of water and juice containers, as well as increasing the amount that would go back for the local redemption center. There are also several bills that we're pleased that did not move forward that would interfere with the regulation of firearms in the courthouse. We believe that firearms policy in the courthouse should be made between local law enforcement, with the courts, and also with the county supervisors. And there was also legislation pertaining to the order, the party order of a candidate on the ballot, an election ballot. And basically what this legislation would do is whatever party won the governor's office in the last election cycle, that party would be at the top of the ballot in the subsequent election year. And we're pleased that this legislation did not move forward as well, as we believe this is a decision that should be made by the county auditor. And then there was also legislation that would change the REAP allocation formula, which would ultimately change the amount of money that would go back to local county conservation boards for programming. And Lucas, I know there were some others as well.
Yeah, as we talked about earlier, several bills on phasing out or drastically reducing the backfill, and as we discussed, we were very pleased that at the end of session, none of those moved forward. There was also a bill that we've seen for several years now that would get rid of the county compensation board and give those duties to the county supervisors. We are opposed to this. We think that the county compensation board serves a very important role in the work that they do in making recommendations to the supervisors, and ultimately the supervisors do have the final say, so we think that's a worthwhile committee to keep at the county level. As we discussed earlier, there was legislation on supervisor district plans that passed, but I think it's important to note some of the legislation that was proposed that did not pass. First, the House proposed that for those counties over 60,000 in population, they all had to be in Plan 3, which is the equal population districts and voted by the district. Those counties over 60,000 are the top 10 in population, and of those, only 2 currently are in Plan 3. So this would have forced 8 counties to change their representation plan, and that being dictated by the legislature rather than the local voters deciding how they wanted to be represented. The Senate took a little bit different approach before finalizing what did pass. Their first proposal made it so that those counties that were in Plan 1 could move to any other plan, those in Plan 2 could stay or move to Plan 3, and those that are in Plan 3 could not move to a different plan. And once again, taking away the ability of the local voters to decide how they want to be represented. So fortunately, those proposals did not move forward on supervisor district plans. There was also legislation that would take away any liability if an individual was out doing repairs on a secondary road. This is just a normal citizen taking it upon themselves. Obviously, they shouldn't be working on secondary roads, and if they cause damage, that liability needs to remain with them. There is a TIF proposal that would have taken the foundation formula dollars out of the division of revenue. So this would drastically impact the amount of revenue that could be divided for county TIF districts that are set up for economic development and other projects. It would make it very difficult to undertake those projects without being allowed to divide all the property tax revenue as TIF was intended to do. There was also a proposal on local budget certification. So anytime that the budgeted expenditures from property tax was greater in the upcoming year than in the current year, there would be an additional publication and public hearing required. We believe the proposed budget being published and the public hearing process that is in place now is sufficient for the public to be informed on what's going on with the county budget and the property taxes being collected. And finally, there was a proposal on referendum times that would limit any vote on a local option sales tax or a bond referendum to the November general election, and it would eliminate the possibility to have a special election at the other designated times throughout the year that are currently allowed.
Well, even though the 2018 session just wrapped up over a month ago, work begins anew on planning for the 2019 session. And just to kind of give you an overview in terms of the process, what we'll be doing here in June is putting out a request from all of our members for specific pieces of legislation for 2019. That deadline will be wrapped up by the end of July, and then those proposals will be considered by the Legislative Policy Committee when they meet in August. And for those that don't know, the Legislative Policy Committee is the deliberative body within ISAC that goes through all of the proposals for legislation, makes recommendations on what should move forward, and then ultimately makes recommendations to the full ISAC membership and ISAC board on what legislation should move forward for next year. And so, like I said, the proposals, requests for proposals will go out this month, followed by the deadline of the end of July for those proposals to come in. Again, the ISAC LPC will meet to consider those proposals on August 22nd, on the first day of our annual meeting. And then they will meet again in September to consider those proposals and ultimately then make recommendations for what moves forward when they meet in September. Then in October, the full ISAC membership will go through the online voting process to go through the bills and make ultimately recommendations to the ISAC board on what legislation, objectives, policy statements, and also ultimately what will be our priorities for the 2019 session, which will be ratified by the ISAC board when they meet in November.
This session marked the second year of complete Republican control, majorities in both the House and Senate and the governor's office. And as we look ahead to 2019, we should keep an eye on this November's general election. We know that there will be plenty of new faces in January because of a number of retirements. In the Senate, there are 2 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 1 independent senator that will be retiring. And in the House, 12 Republicans and 3 Democrats will not be seeking re-election. So regardless of the outcome, we will see plenty of new faces. Currently in the Senate, Republicans hold a 29 to 20 to 1 majority. For the upcoming election, there will be 4 Democrats running unopposed, 2 Democrats that will not face a Republican but will have a Libertarian opponent, 2 Republicans running unopposed, and 17 contested races. In the House, all seats are up. There will be 25 Democrats running unopposed, 1 Democrat facing a Libertarian, 5 Republicans running unopposed, and 69 contested races. Currently in the House, Republicans hold a 59 to 41 majority. So we will be watching the election very closely to see if majorities might change, how many incumbents are returning, and who we will have the pleasure of working with come January. I'd also like to note all 4 congressional seats will be up for re-election this year with competition in all 4 of those, as well as former Clark County Treasurer Kim Reynolds running for her first full term as governor, and former Story County Auditor running for re-election, Mary Mosman running for re-election to the office of State Auditor.
Lucas and I are very pleased that you tuned in today to watch and hear about the 2018 legislative session and the policy development process going into 2019. As Lucas talked about before, the process is already in place, and we look forward to working with each and every one of you to develop these proposals and to work on legislation that affects counties. Any final words, Lucas?
I would also like to thank everyone for tuning in, all of the work that you do, staying engaged throughout the legislative session, and helping us do our work by contacting your legislators and making sure that they hear from you on the issues important, not only to your county, but to counties statewide. So thank you for tuning in,